Hey, welcome back to our series on Is Your Architecture Biased? And in this video, we are going to look at the hindsight bias, or as it's otherwise known as Monday morning quarterbacking. Just to level set it a little bit, the hindsight bias is something we see in software architecture and in software delivery projects all the time. And if you don't know what the hindsight bias is, it is essentially the belief that the outcome was predictable after the event has already occurred. So if I use a Monday morning quarterbacking example, you could say on the Monday morning after the Super Bowl, oh, it was so predictable Kansas City were gonna lose because Patrick Mahomes came into the game already injured. Why is that a bias? Because you knew the result of the game already when you made that statement. Now, if you made that statement before, if you made that on the Saturday or the Friday, then that could be valid. But the specifics of this bias is that you're not making that statement on the Friday prior to the event. You're making that statement on the Monday after the event has already occurred. So let's move away from the football examples and talk about where this bias occurs in software architecture and software delivery projects. So one of the typical places where hindsight bias can creep in is if a production incident occurs. So let's imagine your site goes down for whatever reason. Maybe you have a performance issue on the site. Maybe there's a bug of some sort and customers can't log in, or there's an error appears, or the site goes down completely, or even there's something like a hack or something. That is going to be the typical place where there's a risk that hindsight bias could creep in. And the reason that that could creep in is that what would typically occur in these situations is an independent reviewer. Somebody is going to have to produce an RCA, a root cause analysis of what went wrong in that scenario. And they'll do a review, they'll go and ask a load of questions, they'll find out all the events that led up to that scenario happening so that you can kind of figure out in the future how to take steps so that that incident doesn't occur again. So as the reviewer starts interviewing people or looking at the architecture and trying to paint that picture of all the events that led up to the incident, they of course know that there was an incident. They're not sitting on a Friday trying to figure out what's going to happen in advance. They are looking at it after the event has occurred. So anything that they find in their findings may be obvious to them that it was going to cause an incident, but it may not have been obvious at the time. So let's take a good example. Maybe the incident was that your site went down because you were in a single AWS region and you didn't have something like multi-region availability built into your architecture. And then over the course of that weekend, an AWS region went down. So therefore, you know that the root cause there is that you've not got multi-region support. When you go back and look at the architecture, that reviewer is able to say, well, you know, it's fairly obvious that AWS regions may not be up all the time, and you should have designed your solution to deal with multi-region failovers. And that's great on the Monday morning after having a region failure, but that may not have been obvious on the Friday prior to the incident. So the reviewer has the benefit of knowing what the outcome of the event is. So the second place you might come up against hindsight bias is as you move between stages of a project. And that could be in a waterfall project or it could be in an agile project. So let's imagine I'm a waterfall project for just now. So I'm going from a design stage to a build stage or to a test stage and then to a user acceptance stage or a performance stage, and then finally into production. So as you go through those stages, you're going to be subject to a stage gate review where somebody's going to look at your architecture, your designs, test your code, and then decide whether you can move on to the next stage. And that's a point where if some sort of issue occurs, then as part of that review, the outcome is already known, and therefore the reviewer might say, hey, you know, this was fairly obvious. How did we get to this stage already? And again, this isn't just a waterfall thing. This is exactly the same in Agile. Of course, in Agile, it's going to happen more frequently, but of course, that same bias can occur. So let's take my backlog, for example. I'm going to take an item off the backlog. I'm going to refine a user story. I'm going to bring it into sprint. And then when I get to the end of that sprint, I may discover that that user story can't be implemented. Maybe I didn't have enough information. Maybe the design wasn't great. And then when I retrospect that, or when I play that back at the end of the sprint, I'm going to go, oh my goodness, this didn't work for this, blah, blah, blah. And you're going to think to yourself, oh, I wasted a couple of weeks here on this sprint, you know, implementing this feature, and I should have known that in advance. Well, of course, you are at the end of that sprint. So the outcome is already known, but of course you didn't know that at the beginning of the sprint. So again, we're subject to this hindsight bias where you know the outcome of the event prior. And probably the third place where where you can experience hindsight bias is going to be in technology choices. So as I start defining my architecture, maybe I'm going to say I'm going to choose this content management solution over this content management solution. Or maybe I'm going to pick a framework such as React over Angular, or maybe I pick a GraphQL over REST. And then later on, as I go through the stages of a project, I discovered that my technology choice was wrong. Maybe it wasn't fast enough, maybe it had too many bugs, maybe it wasn't secure, maybe it wasn't fully implemented. It doesn't really matter, right? But if somebody was to come along and review that, they might be saying, hey, that was completely obvious. You should have known that that technology wasn't suitable for the task that you're doing. So again, you're subject to hindsight bias because the outcome is already known at that point. So now that we know where hindsight bias creeps into the software delivery lifecycle, how do we do something about it? So the first technique that we can use is to do a pre-mortem review. I'm sure a bunch of you are thinking, what is a pre-mortem review? Well, the easiest way of thinking about that is it's essentially the same as a post-mortem review, except you're going to do it at the beginning of a project or before a deployment or before a particular phase in your delivery. And what you're going to do is bring all of your stakeholders together, whether it's project managers, whether it's architects, whether it's developers, testers, deployment folks, whether it's the customer, whether it's business analysts, whatever. You're going to bring them all together in one single place, and you're going to pretend that the project has already failed. Yeah, whereas a post-mortem review, the project has failed. But in this case, in a pre-mortem review, you're going to pretend that your project or your delivery, or you're going to pretend the incident has occurred, and you're going to list down all of the reasons why that might have happened. So let me show how that could kind of work in a virtual world. So I'm just going to bring up my screen for a second, and then I'm going to bring up a virtual whiteboarding tool. So in this case, I'm going to use Mural. So I'm going to click here and I'm going to select Create New Mural. We'll select a blank mural in this case, and that will just create me a virtual environment. So let's just delete this for a second. And as you see, it's a virtual whiteboarding tool. So all I would do in this session is grab some sticky notes, and they would write reasons why that project might fail. So let's simulate a pre-mortem review that might occur for a production application. So we would just list down all the reasons our software could fail. So let's drop a sticky note in here, and it could be the single AWS region, for example. Reason could be not configured multiple availability zones. Could be that you've never tested production traffic. So never tested production workload. Could be that you maybe you've got no monitoring software. So you wouldn't know if an issue actually occurred. It could be that you've got no logging. All right. So even if an incident occurred, you wouldn't know what happened. So once you spent a bit of time listing out all of those reasons with the virtual whiteboard, then you're going to have a review session amongst everyone where you're just going to talk about why that project might fail, why you put down that particular issue, and then you can then create an action plan at the end of it. Now, why this is important, back to hindsight bias, is if you've done a pre-mortem review, then you've got a record in time. Yeah, you've looked ahead into the future. You listed out all the things that could go wrong. So if something does go wrong in the future, then when you're in those reviews, you can come back to the pre-mortem review and say, actually, we captured this. We figured this was a reason. We ended up putting it on a risk and issue board. So that's another technique that you could have, is a RAID log, which it has all your risks and issues and dependencies, etc., up on a board. And all the actions that you need to take to deal with that. So anything that comes out of this pre-mortem review session can end up on your plan, it can end up on your risk log, and therefore you've got this audit and you've got an action plan to deal with all of these things that could potentially go wrong. So then if something does go wrong, then you've got an audited record of how you thought about this in advance and who made what decision and how you thought about it. And therefore, hindsight bias can't apply, because if a brand new reason comes up, you can then say, hey, well, you know what? We ran a pre-mortem review. We looked at all of the issues, and that particular issue that we're talking about just didn't come up. It didn't occur. So how could it be obvious it was going to occur in the future if we didn't figure this out in this pre-mortem review session? And maybe your reviewer was even part of that session. So again, it's a really great technique. So actually that technique is not just about trying to cover yourself for when things go wrong. It's really about trying to predict what's going to go wrong so that you can do something about it, right? But the main thing is you're not going to have that hindsight bias if something does go wrong, because you've tried to think in the future. So pre-mortem reviews are really good for counteracting hindsight bias when it comes to things like production incidents, and it also is good for things like project phases, right? As you move from one phase to another, whether it's agile or waterfall, right? That is a great technique to try and predict those issues in advance, right? But it wouldn't really help for things like technology choices, right? Did you get your architecture right? So one of the techniques that you can use in that case is architectural decisions or architectural decision records. And what an architectural decision record is a record in time of how you came to a certain architectural decision or technology choice. And what would typically be in an architectural decision record would be things like title, status, what the background context of your decision is, what were the decision drivers, right? What's driving you to make that decision in the first place? What was the outcome of the decision? What did you finally decide? And then more importantly, why? Right? What options did you consider, right? If there was multiple choices. So maybe you were choosing multiple content management systems. So you would list out all the various content management systems that you thought about. You would put the pros and the cons, and you try and think about what each one is good at, what their integrations would be, how it suits your project. And then when you finally get to that decision, you can say, well, I weighed up all of these options and we considered it. And more importantly, you must have who was present in that decision. So of course, if something goes wrong in the future and somebody says, oh, that CMS you picked was terrible, it was obvious that it was the wrong choice for this project, then you can go back to the architectural decision record and say, well, we considered this, we considered that, these were all the pros and these were the cons, these were the people who made the decisions, and you can show that audited record of how you came to that decision. But of course, architectural decision records also deal with other biases. So things like halo effect or confirmation bias, right? Because you're really spending the time thinking about the options that you're making and not going for the things that you know. And if you want to see a video on the halo effect and how that can affect your architecture and how architectural decision records can help you with that, then click on the link on the top right of the screen. So I'm not going to deep dive architectural decision records in this video. I'm probably going to do that in a future video. But what I thought I would do is show you very quickly a typical example of an architectural decision record out in the field. So I'm going to open an architectural decision record that Backstage has. If you don't know what Backstage is, it's a kind of developer portal with a kind of catalog repository of various templates for creating software with reusable patterns. Very cool stuff created by Spotify. I love it to bits. But what they've done is they've listed out their architectural decision records on their website, which is really cool. And you can just sort of look at it. So here's one here, use ADR 010, use the Luxon date library, and then you can kind of see it's got the context, it's got links, it's got what the decision are and what the consequences are. So they've got a different format from others, but the fact is there is a thought process and they've listed out their decision. And again, that's a technique that you can use and it will help deal with hindsight bias. So if you get those technology choices wrong, then you can go back to that and say, hey, this is how we came to that decision. But of course, it also helps you not just deal with things going wrong, it helps you think about all of the options that you've got available to you. If you want to look at architectural decision record formats that are available online, you can just kind of Google architectural decision records and it'll come up. But one I really like was by Joel Parker Henderson. It's a markdown format. I really like markdown for architectural records. You can therefore put them on Git. So really great technique, and it makes it nice and simple, and it means that your ADRs are very, very close to your software, right? So they're where the code is, there's the decisions to go with it. So it's not hard to find. But if we kind of scroll down there, it's exactly what we said before, right? What's the title of the problem? What's the status? Who were the listed deciders? When was the decision made? Context, decision drivers, considered options. So it's a great template. You can just use that, go Google it and then pick it up, or you can use another template that you like. And finally, it's not just enough to have architectural decision records. You need to make sure the right people are part of that decision process. So whether it's things like having an architectural review board or something like a design authority, it's really important that you get the right stakeholders involved, that the information gets circulated, you become an information radiator so everybody is aware of that decision. Maybe on things like GitHub, you can use things like GitHub discussions to open it up to the wider audience, but really radiating that information so everybody knows the decisions that you made and how you came to those decisions. And therefore, that's going to deal with things like hindsight bias. So in that unfortunate event that if something does go wrong, you've got that record of how you got there. So anyways, I hope you found this video useful and it helped you identify where hindsight bias can exist in your architecture and your projects. And I'm hoping that you found the techniques useful, whether it's pre-mortem reviews, whether it's architectural decision records, whether it's design authorities or architectural review boards that you can put in place to help eliminate that bias and also make sure that you can anticipate the sort of things that can go wrong with your projects and have more considered and less biased options in the future. Anyway, speak soon.